Let's look at the American political landscape. The way I see things is a gross oversimplification because it's more complicated than this. But it seems to me that politically, we see three groups which have emerged with greater or lesser power. We see, I'm going to call them the Tucker Carlson, Vivek Ramaswamy. Some people would call them MAGA, but I don't know that it's true for all MAGA. People say it is. I'm not sure that it is. But there's a branch which actually believes that Ukraine is evil, that Putin is good. They have many, many layers deep of propaganda that they have bought into, and they're either overtly or secretly supportive of Russia and of Putin, and they are essentially the equivalent of Holocaust deniers. They deny what's happening. They think
Right.
it's all a war of false flags perpetrated by the
Right.
Ukrainian government again. They have many, many layers deep of hatred, contempt, and these opinions have largely been reached as a reaction
Hmm.
as opposed to as an investigation.
Hmm.
So they've concluded that, well, we know we hate Biden, we know we hate the mainstream media, and we know we hate the globalists. And so therefore, everything is a lie. And we're going to interpret everything as Putin's the good guy, America is the evil one, and Ukraine is really the evil one. So that's one group. And that was, we heard them through Vivek Ramaswamy and the Republican primaries, where Vivek Ramaswamy actually made repeatedly outrageous, horrendous falsehoods constantly about
Oh,
Ukraine, easily rebuttable, but I'm not sure even the other candidates were ready to rebut it. That was
Nikki
something
Haley was. She was the only one.
she did. That's true. But even she, there's only so much you can say in a presidential debate.
Yeah.
You know, Ramaswamy said, you can't tell me three provinces in the East. And in fact, she did, but it was she, after the barrage was done, she did say, and what I wanted to say is, since when has anybody called the Oblast of Ukraine a province? That's not a term we use, Mr. Ramaswamy. You need to do better than look something up on Google. You have to actually study the questions you're asking. But beyond that, he laid out a false claims of religious persecution, of many different things, and that was his argument. The second group, I would say, would be those that see the Biden administration as being the great champions of Ukraine and the man that's fought for Ukraine, et cetera. I take exception with that. In that, I acknowledge the willingness to stand with Ukraine against Russia. I've already said that. Glad for that. Zero vision of victory.
Mm-mm.
And that's been a problem because you can make the argument that it's actually immoral to prolong and protract a
Right.
war where people keep dying and dying and dying, and there's no clear objective. This was Douglas MacArthur's comments to Harry Truman that got him fired. And this has always been the problem of political weak individuals in America is they start something and they're not winning. They don't have a vision to finish it. And
Mhm.
unfortunately, the Biden administration has been weakness and lack of clarity. And I really honestly feel quite badly for European countries that see it clearly. And I feel badly for Ukraine that they've had to be played with this way.
Yeah.
As happy as I am that they've gotten something, it seems like a problem to keep going. The third group are people that recognize that the Russian advancement is actually an existential threat to the West and that the only path is victory. And so we have to take what steps is necessary for Ukraine to have victory. And within this camp, there might be some, I don't think so, but there might be some that believe in some sort of a settlement where Russia walks away with some property, but the war ends. But I think the majority of people who hold to the victory perspective realize that if you give Vladimir Putin Ukrainian lands, you've not only ceded the debate, but the war will never end. It
Right.
will continue. What are your thoughts on that analysis?
No, I think that's right. If you're dividing the political landscape with respect to Ukraine, the one of the reasons I think why there's always been people in America that like fascism. And in the 1930s, we had Father Coughlin. He
Of course.
ran a radio. He was the Tucker Carlson of the 1930s. There was a time when 25% of the population, 30 million of the 120 million Americans were listening to his radio broadcast every week. He's a fascist. He was pro Mussolini, pro Hitler, a Christian. He was a Catholic priest. Sounds familiar. So plus ça change, plus c'est la même, right? The real issue, the big picture problem with our politics, like we talked about, algorithms, echo chambers. If you're watching Fox News or you're watching MSNBC, we hear what we want to hear and what makes us mad, and that everything gets reinforced. But it can't be changed because of the primary system that we have. We have a system that encourages the extremists to win, and with between gerrymandering districts where you're 80 or 90% of that House seats are safe, and partisan primaries, you end up with rule by minority. And the American government today is ruled by minority. Like most Americans want to support Ukraine, but they can't because we have this terrible partisan primary system. We need to make some structural changes, or I think it's just going to get worse. And if America is not functioning, there will be a vacuum in the world, and that vacuum will fill in the multipolar world that we have between Russia, China, the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, those countries wanting to grow up. India is important now. It's a complicated world, and we're facing that complicated world not as a leader, but as a completely incompetent, hamstrung, country that can't even fund our own government half the time. We're in a fight over, do we keep the lights on every few months?
Terry, make the case for someone who may be tuning in and listening to this, that supporting Ukraine is cost effective, is economically in the best interest of the United States, and is not just throwing money away that we never see again to some foreign nation thousands of miles away.
So what's actually happening, if you don't listen to the rhetoric from the pro-Putin wing of our Congress, if you look at what's actually happening when we send $1 billion in military equipment or whatever, we're sending Ukraine our old leftovers, which, by the way, is wrong. We should be sending them our good stuff, but we're sending them the old missiles that are about to expire, et cetera. And then we're paying our own contractors, Raytheon and Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop Grumman, to build new replacement. So basically, this is a stimulus package for the aerospace and defense sector that is giving the U.S. military newer, more modern equipment while we give the old stuff to Ukraine. And it's about 5% of our defense budget. So for the cost of 5% of our defense budget, we have completely degraded one of our main adversaries. We have two main adversaries, Russia and China. The Russian army is a disaster for everybody who thinks it's this big, bad, you can't beat them army. They're completely exhausted. They've lost, I think, 90% of their starting strength is lost, killed or wounded. They've taken 90% casualty. Now they've had a big mobilization, so they've replaced them with hundreds of thousands of ethnic minorities who are untrained. But the Russian army has been incredibly degraded. They've lost thousands of vehicles and aircraft. Their men are exhausted. They don't get leave. It's not like year rotations like they had in Vietnam. They're just there forever. So for 5% of our budget, without losing a life, we can not only increase our standing in the world and have nations believe in America and help lead the world in the direction of democracy and freedom, but we can also degrade and hopefully defeat one of our main enemies, who's not only fighting us in Ukraine, they're helping Israel's enemies. They're helping destabilize Africa, which is really important because of the minerals in Africa. The mischief and death that Russia causes in Africa is immense. And so for 5% of our budget, we can help that. Fighting them in the next battle, fighting China over Taiwan is going to be a lot more expensive than having $100 billion stimulus package for our own defense industry. And that's what's going to happen. If China says that the West is decadent and they're not strong and they won't stand together, if they see that we can't even defend a European country in Europe, then they know that we're not going to be able to go 10,000 miles around the world to defend um, Taiwan. And that's going to cost us a lot more. The economic interdependencies between us and China and Taiwan, if those are disrupted, that will crush the global economy. So what we're doing now, you know, it's like, do you mind paying $10 a month for life insurance when you get millions of dollars of payout? But you know, it's worth paying that small down payment up front to protect yourself in a huge way down the road.
What should we be doing for Ukraine right now? Specifically, what kind of weapons? What are the preferable weapons?
Yeah,
So,
they need artillery shells. This is a World War. It's a World War I battle. They need hundreds of thousands of artillery shells. Europe promised them 1 million. They've only given them a third of that. They haven't given them two-thirds of what they promised. Our Ukraine and Russia had artillery parity last year. They don't anymore. Russia's firing like 3 to 4 times as many artillery shells every day. We need to give them ATACMS missiles. It's an Army surface launched missile, can go a few hundred miles. They need to be in country tomorrow. If Ukraine had those, when we gave Ukraine the HIMARS, which is a shorter range missile, it immediately took out a few Russian air bases, and those helicopters and jets are killing Ukrainians every day. Like they had an immediate effect of stopping the air attacks against Ukraine. If we give them these unmanned guided missiles, and we have thousands of them, we have a bunch of them that were made when I was based in Korea. ATACMS came out. They're expiring. We're literally going to pay a contractor millions of dollars to cut these missiles in half. Give them to Ukraine. The Biden administration has been afraid because what if Ukraine launches them into Russia? That'll start World War III. A, it's not going to start World War III. B, Ukraine has done probably hundreds of attacks in Russian territory. It hasn't started World War III. And C, of course, they should be attacking military targets in Russia. That's where they're launching missiles that kill Ukrainians. Of
Yeah.
course, those are viable targets. So if they had ATACMS, the Kerch Bridge would come down. The Kerch Bridge is the main connection between Crimea and Russia. It is the crowning achievement of Putin's life. It's this 18-mile long bridge. Ukraine had it looked like a suicide bomb, or a truck went across it and really damaged it badly early in the war, but they repaired it. But if you dropped the Kerch Bridge, the amount of pain that would cause the Russian military and all the Russian people living in Crimea would immediately be a huge weight around their neck. When we give them F-16s, the point is not the F-16. I flew the early 1970s A models F-16s. They wouldn't help them at all. The point is the weapons that we give them with the F-16. And there's something called JASM, AGM-158. It's a long-range strike missile. The French and the Brits have given them Storm Shadows and Scalps. We have a better missile than that. And if we gave them that, again, all these Russian air bases that are launching attacks would be gone. The Kerch Bridge could be gone. All of their oil facilities and ammo storage, and there's all this stuff that's safe. And if we just gave them these weapons that could be in country tomorrow, that stuff wouldn't be safe anymore. The Russian whole effort would just come grinding to a halt. So I think things that give them, Ukraine hasn't been able to do what's called interdiction. Interdiction is hitting the enemy behind their lines, 50 miles, 100 miles, 200 miles deep. And those weapons allow them to do interdiction. And it would make a huge difference. Everybody thinks that the counteroffensive was a failure. Well, they did a counteroffensive without air superiority, not only without any air ability. American military has not had air superiority, not had air superiority since like the beginning of World War II. We literally have not fought a battle in Vietnam or Korea or Afghanistan without air superiority, if not air dominance. And we're asking them to kick one of the biggest armies on earth out of entrenched positions without any air capability. That's insane.
Terry, the Ukrainian Air Force of actual fighter pilots is not vast. maybe 500 jet pilots that are engaged in this war on behalf of Ukraine right now. Some of them are friends of mine. Some of them are friends of honor. I know these men. What's the best that we can hope for them? I mean, presently there are Ukrainians that are getting training in F-16s. I would say a fast track approach in some cases, not as fast track in other cases. They have to learn the English language. They have to learn to master the F-16. They have to hope that the F-16s will get to them through Denmark or however it's going to get to them
Right.
ultimately. And then they have to face Russian planes, which are probably superior to the F-16s. How do we get, how, should I be worried about my friends? Um, sh how do we bring Ukraine to a position where they can actually hope to have air superiority over their own nation with such a small air force and with
Yeah.
inadequate planes?
It's not going to be overall air superiority, but it can be localized air superiority. The airplane that we should be giving them is the F-35. If we took a fully operational U.S. Air Force F-35 squadron and gave them a month, the Russian army would cease to exist. I mean,
F-35.
F-35, it can operate. The F-35 would completely destroy the Russian army. Give us a month. And if your vision is to win and kick Russia out, the tool to execute that vision is the F-35. It's not the F-16. But the F-16 can do air defense. So when all these
It's an
missiles,
improvement. It's an improvement over the old Soviet models
that's a
there.
huge improvement. So it could help reduce the number of missiles that are killing Ukrainians every day. And it's a launch platform. So it has some capabilities that could take out Russian air defenses. I think the Russian air defense network could be really degraded if you gave a squadron of F-16s a month to do that and the proper weapons. And once the air defenses are degraded, then you can start flying deeper into enemy territory. But the first thing you have to do is take out those surface to air missiles. Russian surface to air missiles are really, really good. Like you don't want to fly an F-16 into them because they'll get shot down. So, but we have these standoff weapons. That's what I'm saying. If we give them the standoff weapons, um, the problem is like the Netherlands today said they're going to give them F, I guess six more F-16s, which is great, but like you need 100. So, and that just takes time. That's why on February 24th, 2022, I tweeted out, hey, we need to start training Ukrainian pilots and most importantly, the ground crews on F-16s today. We need to send ATACMs and Patriots today. That was 2 years ago, and we're still, dawdling along. But it's better late than never. So the key point is not the F-16s themselves. The key point is the weapons that we give them. And it's not going to be an end all, but it's certainly going to make life more painful for Russian. More Russian army will be destroyed once Ukraine has operational F-16s, and less Ukrainians will be killed once they get the F-16.
The Patriot missiles, are they primarily used in a defensive measure to
Yeah,
protect against incoming, right? So,
absolutely. Yeah.
so by sending Patriots over there, we are literally saving the lives of women and children. We're
And by
literally,
not the
pardon me?
positive of that is by not sending them, we're allowing women and children to be killed. And by the way, so America should be doing more. Unless America leads, Europe is just pitiful. They're pitiful. They're not going to lead. And Estonia and Lithuania and Poland, they would definitely lead, but they're not big enough to do that. Um, but Europe still has a lot of equipment. Why are there any air defense systems in the nations of Spain, of France, of Italy? They should all 100% be in Ukraine today. And Spain and France and Italy specifically and Portugal have given fractions of hundredths of a percent of their GDP. They basically hardly given anything. It's really pitiful. Russia is not going to invade Spain anytime soon. Like there should be no tanks in Spain. There should be no air defense systems. They should all be in Ukraine. And so the Europeans need to step up and realize they've been living with America protecting them for the last 30 years. They said it's the end of history after the Soviet Union fell. Let's spend all of our money on welfare and nothing on the military. The British Army has 70,000 soldiers. Like it's incredibly small and ineffective. I think they have one or they're even the British Navy is really pitiful. We're keeping the Red Sea open from Iran and the Houthis. We I think we only get 10% of our trade through the Red Sea, and Europe gets like most of theirs. So basically, we're protecting European commerce because they're incapable because they don't have the military they need. It's even though America should be leading right now and we should be doing more, the Europeans need to wake up, and they've had 2 years to do this, and they still can't even make the artillery shells that they need to give the Ukraine. You know, we should be in World War II. We were the arsenal of democracy. Jens Stoltenberg and the senior European officials have said we really need to up our military production capacity, but it's fine to say something. Politicians are always saying stuff. It's actually time to do something. And Germany seems to have woken up a little bit. I think Olaf Scholz finally said, all right, we need to, Germany needs to get over its World War II hangover and realize that it's not World War II anymore. It's time to, you know, show some leadership. And so Europe needs to step up.
Ukraine wins, what happens to the world? Ukraine loses, what happens?
Yeah. Well, if Ukraine wins, China doesn't invade Taiwan. Countries say, hey, maybe I want to be on team freedom and democracy instead of team BRICS. America has, assuming that America doesn't advocate and Europe helps them win, assuming America helps them win, then our standing is, then we're back. Then we're not, you know, make America great again. And then we're back. I think I think we need this. I don't know if we call it NATO. It was called Trans-Pacific Partnership as an economic bloc. We need some multilateral organizations in the Pacific because, you know, to counterbalance China's influence there. Um, Winning in Ukraine would definitely help out with winning in the Pacific. Winning in Ukraine would help us out in Africa. The West doesn't have the best reputation in Africa. There's lots of dictators that are in power because of Wagner and Russia. If we win, we'll start to get some influence in Africa, which is important because of the resources that they have. Um, Africa has a huge amount of potential if they can get past the endemic corruption and diseases like malaria. There's a lot of growth potential in Africa.
I was just going to say that I was in sub-Saharan Africa during the Reagan years, uh, fighting for freedom against the Cubans and the Soviets in Angola, Namibia, and even South Africa. I have a brother today who has an organization and fights for freedom in the Sudan.
Wow.
And while I was there in Angola, for example, against the Cubans back
Right.
in the 80s, uh, one thing that was just stunning to me, really stunning, was the number of Africans who were picked up by the Soviet Union and sent to Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow for training in terrorism.
Mhm.
And I met some of these people. I met a broad diversity of people. I met one man who became a convert to Christianity, but who had been trained in all sorts of terrorism in Moscow. And he explained to me, this is what they taught us to do. And there were torture techniques, and it was remarkable to hear it. But I think that Americans have kind of forgotten the role of destabilization around the world and the hungriness that Russia had both during the Soviet years and up to the present in Africa. And that just is not that's not a theater we can forget either. Ukraine is the defining theater of the moment, but Africa remains something of great relevance to the future freedom in the world as well.
Absolutely. And African, yeah, it's an important part of geopolitics. And I think you know, it just comes back to, I think World War III's begun. Either we win and it's the last battle, or we lose and it's the first battle. The longer this goes on, the more clear that becomes.
Um, what's your message to the people of Ukraine right now? As an American, as an astronaut who's worked with cosmonauts, as somebody who views the dynamic in America, what do you want to say to Ukrainians?
the American people are with you. We need to work hard to get our politicians off of their butts and to do the right thing. But the American people are with you, and the future of Ukraine is very bright. The future of Ukraine is with the West. The future of Ukraine is going to be freedom and democracy. The economy of Ukraine is going to be growing for decades to come. Our goal right now is to end this pain of the war as soon as possible and move on to those good times. Um, so that's the, like I said in the beginning, the big picture is the Ukraine trajectory is up and Russia trajectory is down. We just need to end this disastrous war. And by the way, it's a disaster for Russia, like I mentioned. I mean, the number of Russians that are killed, their reputational damage. The main damage is for the Ukrainians, and we can't just have a deal that ends the war. Like the Russians needs to pay for the reparations that
Clearly.
hundreds of billions of dollars. The amount of damage they're doing is just insanity.
And we need, and if we're going to learn lessons of that, we started off today talking about World War II. If we're going to learn the lessons of World War II, we need trials.
Uh, unless we have that, they're just going to
And
go
let,
on.
that's right. And these people are war criminals and they need to be brought to justice. There is a legitimate jurisdictional question as whether Ukraine should
Right.
try the criminals. I think they have original jurisdiction there. Um, to the extent that Russia is in some way part of conventions and the international order, I know a lot of people want to bring them to The Hague, but under any reality, the Russians, war criminals, need to be tried, and this cannot be brushed under the rug. It cannot, or we will be paying for it for the next 100 years.
Yeah. I just saw there's a movie out called Zone of Interest. That's a German language
Oh,
movie.
you saw that film. I need to go see it.
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
I didn't know what it was about. I thought it was about Nazis in France. And uh, if I was thinking that looks like Auschwitz or this feels like Auschwitz. And then I'm like, it's Auschwitz. And then they showed some pictures from Auschwitz and it gave me PTSD because I was just there. I literally have the same pictures that they showed from the actual camp. Um, it was a really creative way to tell the story of the camp commandant, Rudolf Hirsch, I think. But he gets obviously he got hung after the war. So when you're talking about
Mhm.
having a trial, um, it was an interesting movie. It's not necessarily a page turner. It was like incredibly slow, but it was an interesting way to tell the story. I'll leave it at that. I think it's worth seeing. Um, but it was surprising to me.
This whole issue of the potential of man to commit inhumanity to other people and the ability of everyday citizens to join in into unthinkable crimes is something that we have to come to grips
These are
with.
Russians pushing the button. They're not Vladimir Putin is not pushing that red button that launches the missiles. These are Russian men.
Terry, one of the founders of our organization, Ukraine Story, was the equivalent of a first responder into Bucha. He retired from the U.S. Army to join and to help out with Ukrainians, and he was there at the very beginning in April after the Russians withdrew, and it was his job to sort of catalog and see what had happened, and also to determine if there were. He was specifically there to see if mines had been left, but he ended up being exposed to everything that was there. And one of his missions was to uncover the names of the Russians that were and the units that were there that were committing atrocities. Um, we're talking, I don't know the ages of the boys because I haven't seen that data yet, but we're talking Russians just using children as target practice,
Mhm.
claiming to open up green corridors for their escape and mowing everybody down. We're talking about first raping the children and then killing them. We're talking about murdering fathers and sons, bullet to the back of the head in their own yards. And this is done by people that are pulling the trigger, not Vladimir Putin.
Right. Now they were
He,
told that they were Nazis and
that's right. That's right. And, bad things happen in war, but we're talking horror stories. And, there's a question, is this a systemic problem within the Russian army? Is this a fun, is this a,
Oh yeah, that's the Russian way of war.
and it seems to be
Ready
that
from
way.
Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, Afghanistan. Yes, this is the
It,
Russian way of
it
war.
seems to be. And what a lot of Americans don't understand is, one of the ironies of the present political debate is that the people like Tucker Carlson, who is in Moscow today, presumably, we'll find out soon enough. By the time this podcast airs, we'll probably know the answer, but presumably to interview Vladimir Putin. And Tucker's message has been, everyone's lying to you except for me. I'm the only one that's not lying to you. Everyone out there is basically bringing you a falsehood. But when you go to Ukraine and you realize that you have thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people that are eyewitnesses to different forms of Russian illegal criminal war and various things like that, there needs to be public discussion.
Yeah,
There needs to be justice. There has to be justice, and um, Americans of all people should be aware of why that is so very, very important. What's your
absolutely.
message? Okay, we talked about your message to Ukraine. We have a very divided America. If you're standing up, you're giving a stump speech, and you have to simplify the issue, what are you going to tell Americans?
There's an old saying, I'd rather fight him in the Middle East than in the Midwest. I'd rather stop this authoritarian march in its tracks right now for a small fraction of our defense budget than have to fight them with American soldiers 5, 10 years down the road. It's that stark of a choice. We either win in Ukraine or we try to win in Taiwan or in Finland or Estonia or somewhere else. Um, that's the message. You either win now for cheap or you win later, maybe. And by the way, just because we won World War I and World War II doesn't mean we're going to win World War III. There is no manifest destiny. And our debt deficit level right now is frighteningly high. And so it's going to be harder economically to be the arsenal of democracy than it was in decades gone by. There's a couple other good things. First of all, NATO has expanded, Finland and Sweden. That's really good news. And I'm sure you saw the news, but recently a Russian bomber pilot, this major from Engels Air Base in Russia, because the Russians are cowards. They don't fly their bombers over Ukraine. They stay within Russian territory because they know Ukraine won't come into Russia and launch these missiles that kill civilians from Russia. And this guy got shot. And my Ukrainian friend, he had the funniest term. He's like, yeah, that's the Ukrainian Mossad. So that's what they're calling Ukrainian intelligence.
Mm.
It had a great speech yesterday. The message I would have for Russian pilots would be what the GUR, I think the
Yeah.
Ukrainian CIA, they said, hey, we know where you live. We know the routes you drive to work. We know where your family is. We know your habits and tendencies. So let's be ready. Of course, they're being a little hyperbolic there, but it was so good to see them kill a Russian pilot in Russia at home. Like that has got to put fear into all the thousands of Russian pilots who are committing these war crimes every day. They all know it. And it's not reported on Russian news, but all the Russian pilots know that their buddy got shot in his house. And they were posting pictures of him with his wife and kids. So that is something that really has put fear into the hearts of those guys.
Well, friends, I want to thank all of you for joining us on this special broadcast today with my friend Terry Virts, who has accomplished so much in his life for the U.S. astronaut program as an F-16 pilot and now as a defender of freedom. And today, who has a message: let's stop future war by helping our friends fight in their own backyard against immeasurable evil, which is taking place today. To our friends, to our Ukrainian friends, our European friends that are tuned in around the world, we encourage you to stand fast, lift your arms in prayer for the people of Ukraine, for victory, for complete victory for this beautiful nation. They have so much to offer the world, and that there would be an end to the normalization of mass destruction, torture, mayhem against civilians, which are there. Until next time, this is DW for Ukraine Story, thanking you for joining us on the Ukraine Story podcast, and Slava Ukraini.